Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The head of NHS England says he wants the £350 million a week promise for the health service by Vote Leave campaigners. Simon Stevens says that without the money, 1 in 10 people will be left on waiting lists for treatments.
The NHS wasn't on the ballot paper, but it was on the ballot bus. Vote Leave for a better funded health service, £350 million a week. By the end of the next financial year for the NHS, March 2019, the United Kingdom will have left the European Union. Trust in democratic politics will not be strengthened if anyone now tries to argue, you voted Brexit partly for a better funded health service, but precisely because of Brexit, you now can't have one.
It wasn't a government promise. It was a promise by the Leave campaign. But what I very much agree with is that if there is a Brexit dividend, if we end up having less pressure on public finances because of the fact that we're not making net contributions to the EU, then I believe that the NHS should be the first port of call.
Well, let's talk to Anita Charlesworth, the Chief Economist at the charity The Health Foundation. And Anita, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Quite a bleak warning from Simon Stevens about the current state of the NHS.
Yes, there are very clear risks after 7 years of austerity. The NHS, if funding continues at the path laid out by the government, then we will see increasing waiting lists, promised improvements to cancer care and mental health are at risk, and rather than having more nurses and GPs, we face the prospect of having fewer. Now, this is a choice for us, as Simon Stevens has laid out. If we provide additional funding, we can have the world-class NHS that we all aspire to have.
The message is more money for the NHS or else patients will suffer. How did we as a country get to this point?
Well, we've had 7 years of funding growing at a much lower rate than pressures on our service. Over the next 5 years, we'll have almost 1 million more people over 65. That's a great triumph, but it brings with it a cost. As people age, they have more healthcare needs, and modern medicine is advancing at a pace. There are breakthrough drugs in a range of conditions that transform people's lives, but they're expensive and they have to be paid for.
We've been told by independent analysts that when the budget comes, we need at least, at the very least, £4 billion to keep the NHS afloat. Do you think that money will be coughed up?
Well, so I think it's obviously a lot of money, but if we remember what we and the other organisations calling for that funding and our analysis shows is that that's the historic rate of funding increase over the first 63 years of the NHS's history. So it is a lot, but actually what we're calling for is a return to that historic path, and the UK is not alone. It's not because we've got a tax-funded NHS free at the point of use that we face these challenges. All healthcare systems across the developed world.
Well, as I've said repeatedly, I said in the House of Commons yesterday, I'm very happy to meet the family, and I'm Mr. Ratcliffe. I'm in fact, I think, very much hoping to see him before I go to Iran in the course of the next few weeks. What I'm doing here is obviously trying to make sure that the Iran nuclear deal is kept going. That is, I think, one of the great triumphs of diplomacy in the last 20 years or so. It took an awfully long time to negotiate. What it does is it stops Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon in exchange for economic cooperation. And what we're trying to do is work with our American friends to find ways of protecting that core of the deal while simultaneously doing things to constrain Iran in the region. That's why we're here. And to be fair, there's a lot of support for our approach.
Foreign Secretary, you said that your comments were taken out of context, but didn't you just get your facts wrong? Did you read your briefing? Was it wrong?
I think you'll find that I went into that in great detail in the House of Commons yesterday and clarified the matter, I think.
Did you get your facts wrong?
You will find, if you study what I said in the House of Commons yesterday, that it's all there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that was the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson talking in Washington, facing questions about the hot water that he's been in over the last couple of days, not giving much away there. So Boris Johnson in Washington responding to that question from the journalist, not really giving much information away. Said that he has been clear, and he said all that he needed to say back in the House of Commons. Well, let's go back to this NHS England story. And Simon Stevens, the CEO for NHS England, says that he wants £350 million a week promised by the Vote Leave campaign to go into the NHS. Anita is still with us. Anita, what about the claims that, well, look, if you put more money into the NHS, other government departments will suffer, other areas in the country that desperately need money, also local governments, for example, they will suffer even more?
I think everyone is very concerned that if any increase for the NHS is funded by cutting other government departments, we risk making the problem worse. So this would need to be genuinely new funding. We've seen over last winter that one of the reasons why the NHS struggled so much was that patients who were medically fit to go home couldn't go home because local authority social care wasn't available. That's not good for the patients, and it's not good for the NHS. So clearly what needs to happen is genuinely additional funding.
And it's interesting that that is something that the Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt is saying, that is something that Simon Stevens is saying. Everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet here.
Absolutely. I think there's a very clear recognition that whilst the government did protect the NHS from the full force of cuts, funding simply hasn't kept pace with the pressures on our service. And we are faced with a choice now between downgrading what the NHS does or providing that in additional funding. Now, it's a challenge for the Chancellor because the health service is huge, so the sums of money are large, but there's a real opportunity here for us to have a world-class health service.
Anita Charlesworth, Chief Economist at the charity The Health Foundation. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
The head of NHS England has given his starkest warning yet about the impact its financial woes are having on patient care. Simon Stevens says it won't be able to do everything that's asked of it. He told a conference in Birmingham that independent studies show the NHS will face a £4 billion funding gap next year. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
It's a key indicator of how well the NHS is doing. 10 years ago, there were over 4 million people waiting for routine surgery in England. That figure fell to around 2.5 million. But in the past few years, it's risen back to the 4 million mark. Now the head of the NHS is warning it could hit 5 million. From Simon Stevens, this was an unusually direct message aimed straight at Downing Street.
On the current funding outlook, the NHS waiting list will grow to 5 million people by 2021. That's an extra million people on the waiting list, 1 in 10 of us waiting for an operation, the highest number ever.
Simon Stevens is certainly playing a high-stakes game. This was an extraordinary intervention from a senior public official, demanding more money ahead of the budget and warning of the consequences if he doesn't get it.
Rose is one patient who thinks the NHS needs a rapid financial boost. She believes she's missing out on the specialist care she needs for her MS.
You call to make an appointment and they make you wait 2 or 3 weeks. And then when you get in there, they're very busy and they just say, well, actually at this point you should just call physio. And maybe they can help you strengthen your core muscles. And I can't get through to physio. They don't answer their phone, they don't answer emails.
Remember this? The Vote Leave battle bus and the claim that Brexit would mean £350 million a week more for the NHS. That was quoted by Simon Stevens as part of his pitch for more money.
Trust in democratic politics will not be strengthened if anyone now tries to argue, you voted Brexit partly for a better funded health service, but precisely because of Brexit, you now can't have one.
Yesterday,
The Health Secretary said it was a vote leave, not a government pledge, but any Brexit dividend should help the NHS.
if we end up having less pressure on public finances because of the fact that we're not making net contributions to the EU, then I believe that the NHS should be the first port of call.
Any budget funding increase for health in England would automatically mean more money for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's now down to the Chancellor and whether he believes the claims of Simon Stevens. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, it was newsworthy.
Now, the head of the NHS in England has demanded more money for the health service, invoking the contested £350 million Brexit boost promised famously by the Leave campaign on that bus during the EU referendum, warning that hospitals' waiting lists could grow by 25% to 5 million in the next few years. Simon Stevens said unless more money was forthcoming, trust in politics would be damaged. Here's our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Budget coming up, winter round the corner, no signs yet of more money for the NHS and a bad flu season heading this way.
Who have improved their A&E performance.
Not to mention facing an audience of NHS staff who will have to deliver the patient care with all this going on.
This government's approach to the NHS is very simple. It is our most important public service. We want to invest more in it. We know that it needs more investment. It needs more funding going forward because of the huge demographic pressures that we face. And as soon as the economy is able to afford it, we will put that extra investment in.
Last winter, hospitals struggled, missing almost all targets. Next year, funding is set to grow at just 0.4%, one of the lowest growth rates in the history of the health service. Jeremy Hunt is believed to still be putting the case to the Treasury, but today the head of NHS England intervened, painting a bleak picture of staff cuts and more.
On the current funding outlook, it is going to be increasingly hard to expand mental health services or improve cancer care, services the public need and rightly want. And crucially, on the current funding outlook, the NHS waiting list will grow to 5 million people by 2021. That's an extra million people on the waiting list, 1 in 10 of us waiting for an operation.
A political point aimed at central government pledges on cancer and mental health. And he was unstoppable.
The NHS wasn't on the ballot paper, but it was on the ballot bus. Vote Leave for a better funded health service, £350 million a week. Trust in democratic politics will not be strengthened if anyone now tries to argue, you voted Brexit partly for a better funded health service, but precisely because of Brexit, you now can't have one.
The sign, of course, is all about the pressure that the NHS is currently under. But today's speech from Simon Stevens, an extraordinarily strong speech from the head of NHS England, was all about putting pressure on the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's only 2 weeks to the budget, and it is clear that Mr. Stevens does not believe Philip Hammond has heard the pleas, the cries for more funding.
We have been arguing for some time, our frontline trust leaders have been saying they cannot deliver the quality of care and the performance standards that the NHS would want to deliver on the current money.
We've identified that the NHS needs £4 billion next year, and it'll need over £20 billion by the end of the Parliament. That's a lot of money, but what that is a return to the growth in funding that we saw for the first 63 years of the NHS.
Already some services are being rationed in the NHS, hip and knee operations for instance. And today raised the spectre that without more money, indeed without considerably more money, cuts will begin to hit at the very heart of patient care.
Victoria MacDonald reporting there. And I'm joined now by the Conservative MP, Dr. Sarah Wollaston, the chair of the Commons Health Committee. Welcome to the programme. I mean, in Victoria's report, though, we heard all about the issue of public trust. It's not been a great week for public trust in the government. Do you think that the resignation of Priti Patel solves some of that problem of public trust?
Of course, she had to step down. It was right for her to do so.
Should she have been sacked?
Well, she stepped down. I think she would probably have been sacked had she not done so, but I think it was absolutely the right thing to do.
But does this now restore some of that public trust that is woefully lacking?
Well, of course, there is a problem. It would be foolish for anyone to deny that. And I think that it may be that after the budget that Theresa May would be sensible to look at her entire cabinet and see where she needs to go from here.
OK, so let's talk about the NHS. Now, what Simon Stevens said there is quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, he's saying, unless you find that money, which we, by the way, really, really need, public trust in your promises, your ability to deliver promises and act on them is broken. So he's really put the ball back in the government's court.
He has, but of course the government would point out rightly that they never made these promises. These were promises from the Leave campaign.
But they're sitting in government now, some of those people.
And there are many of those people who were on that battle bus are in the cabinet. And I think Simon Stevens couldn't have phrased it better. That if people, many of them, not all of them, but many of them voted Brexit because they believed that figure, if they then hear a message afterwards that says you can't have it because of Brexit, they're going to feel very let down.
And even though that figure was disputed, I mean, a lot of people in government would say it was actually just wrong. It was wrong to mention, but it was resurrected by Boris Johnson, wasn't it?
Indeed, and that's right, and that's why they need to take responsibility. Those people who use that figure need to take responsibility for it. And of course, this works out about 350 million a week, works out about 18 billion a year. And as it happens, that's the figure that we're spending less than France and Germany, who we would like to compare ourselves with on health spending. And Simon Stevens set out very starkly today the consequences of us not working towards these kinds of levels of spending.
And those are pretty dire, aren't they?
They are. They're very stark. We're looking at very considerable increases in waiting lists, but also the pressure on the NHS as a whole. We know that the NHS is working at full stretch. The elastic cannot go any tighter, and have made some extraordinary efficiencies. So it's not all a bad news story. And I think in his speech, he set out some of the things the NHS really has achieved and tried to look at this as a positive story rather than a negative one. People sometimes talk about the NHS as being a drain. We should look at it as a really positive thing.
But even if it's a very positive story, you're going to have to find that extra money. Where will you find it?
Well, I think what we first need to do is we need to stop taking these short-term approaches to the NHS. We need to take a long view, and we need to think not just about the NHS, but social care as well. NHS and social care. We need to have a very honest conversation with the public about how we can find that money. I don't think it can all be found out of borrowing. I think it means that we're all going to have to be prepared to pay some more. There's some very interesting ways that we can do that. And no political party has a monopoly on good ideas. So let's see political parties working together and actually explaining what the options are and actually making it happen for the NHS's 70th birthday.
Sarah Wollaston, thank you very much indeed.
Pretty much all of our major political parties have been accused of playing politics with our health service at one time or another. Well, today, the head of the NHS in England decided to turn the tables on his paymasters by making an overtly political speech himself. Simon Stevens said that pro-Brexit ministers who'd said that leaving the EU would free up money for the NHS must now honour that promise. It is time to cough up, appeared to be his general message.
Never have so many people waited for one bus to arrive. This referendum pledge of more money for the NHS encouraged people to vote to leave the EU. Today, the NHS boss says that claim must now be honoured.
The NHS wasn't on the ballot paper, but it was on the ballot bus. Vote Leave for a better funded health service, £350 million a week.
But without that money, he had a warning.
It boils down to this. On the current funding outlook, the NHS waiting list will grow to 5 million people by 2021. That's an extra million people on the waiting list, 1 in 10 of us waiting for an operation, the highest number ever.
The intervention by the boss of NHS England today is highly significant. Earlier in the year, he suggested the NHS didn't have enough money and he was slapped down by the Prime Minister. Since then, he's kept quiet until today, 2 weeks before the budget, he's piling on the political pressure. In those negotiations, he seems to have found an ally in the Health Secretary. Speaking at the same event, Jeremy Hunt agreed the NHS should get a Brexit boost.
If there is a Brexit dividend, if we end up having less pressure on public finances because of the fact that we're not making net contributions to the EU, then I believe that the NHS should be the first port of call.
This ward performs state-of-the-art brain surgery on children. The chief executive of the Birmingham hospital where it's based says she needs more money, even though the £350 million a week Brexit promise is hotly disputed. She thinks politicians now have to produce it.
My worry is the government did really promote the idea that Brexit would mean more money for the NHS, and the population bought into that message.
Or we need to have a discussion about what you do expect from the NHS. Maybe we should expect less.
Well, this is what I don't understand, because I rarely meet a person who doesn't absolutely believe in the NHS and want to give it the money it deserves.
Everyone agrees the health service needs to be dealt more money, including now Jeremy Hunt. The question is, will the Treasury? Allegra Stratton, News at 10, Birmingham.